Okay.
And
Recording.
my friend who...
And now it's on.
All right, well, the video is rolling, so I guess we've begun. Craig, I think, is getting the door. Great, well, thanks everybody for coming. We're going to talk about Joseph Cambell. This is the first installment of a three-part series about sort of looking at narrative, the different kinds of narrative, through the lens of, from the perspective of a folklorist or an anthropologist. So first, our first stop on this journey is, what did Joseph Cambell get wrong? So Joseph Cambell means a lot to many people. There are a lot of people who have found a lot of value in his work, a lot of personal value, a lot of insight. And just right off the bat, I want to say I'm not here to bash that. You know, I don't want to disparage any value or meaning that you may have derived from his work. It's on a personal level. It's really valid, right? But Cambell, zooming out a little bit, it's good to note that Cambell is perceived as an authority when it comes to study of narrative and study of myth. So if you bring up the study of mythology, usually most people, you know, if you're talking to kind of regular people, they're going to be like, oh yeah, like Joseph Cambell said. So he's sort of on a popular level among a popular, like a general audience. He's really perceived to be like the guy who knows what he's talking about, the guy who has kind of the right take, right? And there's a problem with that because there are problems with his work, which we're going to dive into today. So we're just going to take a tour of kind of the ideas that he has and the ways in which those ideas are found wanting. So first, let's talk about the model itself. This is, you know, Joseph Cambell. I mean, I haven't said this because I assume everybody knows. Joseph Cambell wrote, you know, Hero with 1,000 Faces. He wrote other books about mythology, and he has this notion of the hero's journey. The hero's journey kind of operates on this cycle, right, where you start out at the top and you're kind of like in the normal world, the ordinary world where the hero is sort of living his day-to-day life. And then there's this call to adventure. That's something that comes and disrupts his routine. The hero probably is going to refuse the call at first. He's going to feel resistant. He's going to hold back. He's going to be reluctant. He's not going to want to go or do the thing. But he meets a mentor who provides guidance, who kind of urges him to go ahead and accept the call and engage in the adventure. From there, he crosses the threshold. So now he's not in the ordinary world anymore. He's moving into the world of adventure. And that can take a lot of different shapes. What can signify that moment of crossing into this other space, and at which point he begins to engage in tests or to encounter enemies or opponents, perhaps to get the help of allies. And then from here, there's a moment where he goes to an inmost cave. So he has a deep internal sort of formative, transformative experience that prepares him for his ordeal, which is his primary test, in which he's going to need to exhibit some amount of resolve to get through the confrontation that is ahead of him. Out of that, he receives something of great value, an achievement, an object of worth, something that he is sort of carrying with him out of this experience. At that point, he makes the decision to return. He starts out on the road back. He may encounter other obstacles in getting home that culminate with the final test, the severe sort of final ordeal that he needs to get through in order to cross back into ordinary time or his ordinary life. So at that point, once he's back, he can return, he can come home with the elixir that is the object of worth or the achievement or the knowledge or whatever it is that he's gained. He can come home and bring that home. So that's the hero's journey, right? Now, this model isn't just sort of like one way that stories can take shape. It's not presented as this is just sort of like, yeah, some stories are like this, right? Of course, some stories are. We've all seen Star Wars, right? Which follows the hero's journey, pretty well. It's presented as more than that. It's presented as universal, something that is true of all times and places. It's presented as authoritative, of like, this is deep down what stories are. This is deep down what humans do with hero stories. They follow this model. It's almost on accident, like whether they want to or not. It kind of just bubbles up and comes out of us. So when I was preparing for this, I went ahead and tried to find some places that were commenting on the hero's journey just recently, and a few choice quotes that I came across were describing it as a timeless blueprint. A timeless blueprint for a story. Something that is true of all cultures and eras. From ancient myths to modern blockbusters. This story shows up over and over, and it is described as deeply rooted in the collective psyche. So it's not just something that exists here and there, it's something that says something about who and what we are as humans deep down, right? And this model is not just a description to say, this is how stories are. This is also prescriptive. So this is a model that people use, storytellers use, writers use to say, like, how should I be writing a story? If you're writing a screenplay, you're going to come across the hero's journey at some point, and you're probably going to be encouraged to look for ways to incorporate the hero's journey into the story that you're writing for film, also for literature as well. And it's also held up as prescriptive for how we can make meaning of stories. We're sort of generally invited to think about the hero's journey as a personal framework that you can use to understand your own personal journey and your understanding of the stories that you encounter along the way, right? So it's sort of like a really quick tour of like what the model is and how it works. And what I would say about this, again, we're going to go through kind of a couple of problems with this, and what I'll say to start out with is that Joseph Cambell has a background in comparative literature, and comparative literature is wonderful. I studied literature in my undergrad. I studied anthropology in my grad program. So I have my feet kind of rooted in literature. And as a good literary critic, I will say there's no wrong way to look at stories, right? You can adopt any lens, you can find value looking at things in any way. But when you take this really zoomed out approach, you do run into some problems, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about today. So the first problem is flattening. You need cultural specificity to fully understand a story. What's on screen here is sort of an image from Middle America. We have a bird's eye view of the city of Tokyo, and we have a presentation being given by some native folks in a formal way. Even if, let's just imagine that there is a storyline that can be found from each of these different contexts. A storyline in which somebody sets out and encounters a thing and comes back and brings home a revelation or something. You can just imagine how differently that story would take shape in urban Tokyo and rural America and in a native storytelling context, right? It would be very different. It would have different cultural markers. It would have different cultural meanings. There's all of this cultural specificity that is really important to notice. Now, like I said, Joseph Cambell's whole project was to zoom out and see things from a great distance and sort of notice patterns. Isn't it interesting how the same thing is sort of happening in these different contexts? And yeah, that comparative process is really interesting, but if that's all you do, if that's the main thing you do, if you start to equate this story and that story, this story and that story, you start to engage in some pretty serious cultural flattening, which is not great. the specificities matters. So when I was going through my graduate program, one of my advisors was a Calipuyan anthropologist who was giving me advice on how to responsibly study native myth texts from this part of the world. And he told a story to illustrate the importance of cultural specificity. He said, there's this kind of case study in the Willamette Valley where there's a place called Cascadia Caves. It's near South Santiam, it's east of Sweet Home. And what it is this sort of outcropping of rocks with these petroglyphs on the rocks that are several thousand years old. And this place had been visited by Euro-American settlers as they were moving into the area. And it was visited by Euro-American anthropologists who also came in, looked at the petroglyphs, thought they were really interesting, made suppositions about what they might mean. And their theory was that this was a bear power place, a place of the bear, a place of significance related to bears, right? So time passed, following the 1970s, other people came in, they studied the place, they worked to restore it, and at some point tribal experts were consulted, and they were like, what does this place mean? And it's not a bear power place, it's a fishing site. The images depict salmon, has nothing to do with bears, it's all about fishing. And so, you can see a thing for what it is and completely misunderstand it, right? And that's the thing about the need for cultural specificity, is that if we're seeing this story and noticing that it has a lot in common with this story, cool, that's interesting. But if we're only ever dealing with it at that level, there's a chance that we might be really missing some important nuance, some important meaning, if we're conflating the two and we're like, look, all these people are telling the same story. Then we're kind of missing the whole point, right? So during my graduate research, as I was going through these ethnographic myth texts, I continued to return to my advisor, David Lewis, and ask, do you think I am interpreting this correctly? Here's an interesting pattern. And he also put me in touch with a Coos storyteller and language teacher out on the coast, Patty Warrett Phillips. And so I would call her up and I would say, hey, I'm seeing some interesting themes here in this. Whoops. Wow. Okay.
No, it comes and goes.
Okay, all right.
We'll be back.
So it would be like, I'm seeing these interesting patterns or themes. What do you think? Do you think that this is what the stories are saying? And sometimes she would say, yeah, I think that's a cool point. That's good. And other times she'd be like, well, here's the thing you're not taking into account, or like here's a backstory that you don't know, or here's the thing that's culturally really important that would have been the focus of this kind of story. And so, really working with those tradition bearers, with those cultural stewards, to make sure that I was understanding the stories, not just imposing my assumptions upon them, right? So in short, all this is to say, why is flattening a problem? It skews reality. I mean, it skews your understanding of what the stories are saying. It gives you a misunderstanding of what is really going on in the story. And you could also say it harms people, right? Like, there is kind of a dominant perspective that is sort of replicates itself, and it's sort of a just a sort of prioritizing one perspective, one way of seeing things, and as long as you're always sort of defaulting to one way of seeing things, you're always kind of flattening things into the same shape, you're going to miss a lot of voices, you're going to miss a lot of perspectives, and that's not great, again. So, flattening, first problem. Second problem I would call out in Joseph Cambell's work is the use of stereotypes. He really leans into stereotypes. So Campbell's social views are rigid and essentialist. I'll tell this story. The first time I became aware of Joseph Campbell, I remember clearly when it happened. It was 2007. and I was visiting a friend. I was in the process of trying to move to Portland, and we were staying with them in their house, and one evening they had on this documentary about Joseph Cambell and his work. And listening to this documentary and thinking, he's talking about mythology, I'm really into this is cool. He's talking about how, like, the young man, the hero, has to go out and he has to, like, encounter obstacles, and he has to overcome, he has to have a test of will, he has to have like a visionary experience and then come back with this knowledge and value. And then he takes a moment to pivot and he's like, okay, so this is about men, so what does it look like for women? And the reason I chose this picture of this woman in sort of a circular hut is that his view of what women need to do in order to, like, experience this type of journey. He's like, they don't actually need to experience this type of journey. Women have the answers within themselves because they become pregnant and they carry life and they generate life. They have that already within them. They don't have to go out and seek things outside of themselves. So all they really need to do is, like, he said the ritual for a woman is really just to go inside of the hut and, like, meditate and, like, really understand the source. And and then if you look at how women are presented throughout his work, often it's just a reiteration of stereotypes, right? It's like they either don't have agency, or if they do have agency, they're kind of evil and need to, like, the temptress, like they need to be overcome. And hopefully we can all agree that is a dated, limiting concept that is kind of dumb, that we need to move beyond, right? So that's that. It's also his views on sort of Western versus non-Western people are also not great. He uses dated language, calling people primitive, calling societies and cultures primitive, okay. But he's also going beyond just the use of dated language. He's also sort of presenting people as sort of exotic. He's exoticizing people. He's talking about the primitive medicine man, and he's sort of, like, speculating on all these things without really having any kind of ethnographic knowledge of these people, or seeing them as full people, right? So he's not really seeing the full humanity of many populations in the world. He's just kind of leaning on stereotypes that are sort of rigid. And again, why is this bad? Well, again, it skews reality. Like, if you're not understanding the full humanity of women or of non-Western people, and the intersections of those categories plus other categories I haven't mentioned, like disabled people, there's a lot of people that he isn't reckoning with, that he isn't really listening to or representing. And as long as you are sort of ignoring vast swaths of the population, you're kind of creating a skewed vision of what it means to when you're saying, like, this is what human stories are, like, but you're not representing the whole. That's not great, and it also reinforces social harms of, like, reinforcing these stereotypes that do harm to people. So stereotypes, not so good. Let's move right along. So the next problem with Joseph Cambell's work is the cherry-picking. Models should be made to fit the data, not the other way around. That's true in any kind of science or any kind of research. If you construct a model and you have to work really hard to get the data to cooperate with your model, then you have a bad model, right? So responsible research is letting the data, the real world, inform and guide your conclusions, right? So the way that this shows up in Joseph Cambell's work is, first of all, just right out of the gate, he ignores all the stories that don't fit the hero narrative, right? The hero's journey narrative. There are a lot of cultures in the world. There are a lot of times and places. And if there's one thing that I have learned from anthropology, from the study of anthropology, it's that there are a lot of different ways to be human. So to say that this is sort of a human universal it's true in all times and places. Like, first off, like, anytime anybody says that, I'm like that raises a red flag to me, because, you know, is it? You know, like, it's such a broad statement, and it's so unsupported. Pretty much any generalization you want to make about people, there's probably a culture in which that hasn't been the case. We are a remarkably creative species in how we choose to live and go about our lives. So just right out of the gate, there are plenty of stories that don't fit this narrative. But then, even within the stories that he cites as examples of the narrative, he has to dramatically reinterpret them in order to make them fit, or just ignore them altogether. So, like, for example, in The Belly of the Whale chapter, Cambell talks about stories of people sort of getting eaten or subsumed as a way of being born again or transformed, right? And, you know, the name of the story, Belly of the Whale, we think of Jonah. He didn't want to go to Nineveh. He got swallowed by the whale. He had a change of heart. You know, he got spit out on the beach. He went and he did his prophesying, and that's, you know, that was sort of a transformational experience for him. Great, cool for Jonah. But then Joseph Cambell goes on to list several other stories that he says are sort of doing the same thing. So he lists an Irish story about a character called Finn McCool, who is swallowed by a creature of some sort. Little Red Riding Hood was eaten by the wolf. Maui was swallowed by a figure in his mythology. Zeus's siblings were swallowed by Kronos. And then you have Heracles, who dove into a monstrous mouth and cut his way out. So who's getting transformed here? It's like the Little Red Riding Hood, when she got eaten by the wolf, she didn't have an epiphany. She was just eaten. And then, thank goodness, the woodcutter came along and cut her free, right? And then she was like, whoa, you know, she and Grandma got out. And, like, that wasn't like an ordeal, you know, that she could, like, she wasn't reborn in that way. You know, Maui, when he was swallowed by his creature, he died. He just died. And then Zeus's siblings, who were swallowed by Kronos, you know, they stayed inside of Kronos for a good long while, and then they were eventually cut free, and then they went on about their lives. But they weren't experiencing like an epiphany or a transformation. These are just stories. The thing these stories have in common is somebody got eaten. That's not necessarily like proof of the overarching point that Cambell was trying to make. That, like, we have these sort of like, go into the cave, be remade, come back out, be better, be wiser. So even within the evidence that he presents to support his theory, it's lacking, right? He also makes really broad statements. Here's a quote. He says, "Ancient cities are built like temples, having their portals to the four directions, while in the central place stands the major shrine of the divine city founder." Maybe that's true for some cities, but when you say ancient cities, like, what are you talking about? Like, are you talking about ancient cities in, like, one continent or another continent? Which country? Which valley? Which, you know, what do you mean by ancient even? Are you saying like 2,000 years ago, or are you saying 8,000 years ago? Like, there's been a lot of times and places in the world, and I can guarantee you that not all cities are built on the same floor plan, right? Or on the same city plan. So, you know, just kind of putting forth these really broad statements that are not supported by, either by any argument of his or by the world itself, right? And then probably, I don't know, something that's kind of annoying to me is also just the catch-all statement. So, you know, in the initial model that we were looking at a minute ago, there's this call to adventure, and there's this sort of list of inciting incidents that could qualify as a call to adventure. But those list of events aren't really related to one another. So, you know, when you say I've got this theory in which a thing happens, and then you're like, well, hold on, what about this story where that thing didn't happen? And you're like, oh, no, the thing that did happen in that story is an example of the thing I'm saying. But, like, when you make too broad an array of possible examples, your theory starts to lose meaning, right? So, like, for example, is crossing a threshold really the same as battling one's brother? Is that really the same as battling a dragon? Is that really the same as getting crucified? Is that the same as taking a night sea journey? You know, these are dramatically different events. And to put them all in the same category to say, well, they're all a call to adventure, you're like, all right, well, that is an interpretation that you are making about these events, but that's not necessarily, like, these events don't actually have a lot in common. They're all inciting incidents, okay. You know, a story has to begin somewhere. Okay, so they're all sort of starting a story. But that's not really enough to build a theory on, in my opinion. That's like just a really broad catch-all statement that can't be falsified. Because anytime you're like, okay, well, what about when I went to the grocery store? I got in my car and I started the engine. And he's like, you got in your car. That was the call to adventure. You're like, that's not the same as being crucified. So, you know, it starts to lose meaning, right? So why is cherry picking a problem? I would summarize this by saying, A, it's sloppy thinking, it's sloppy research. More importantly, I think it's a missed opportunity to listen to what the stories are saying, to what you could learn about the stories through responsible research. Like there are so many fascinating things about these stories that you really don't get a chance to experience as long as you're sort of superimposing this kind of simplistic pattern onto them, okay? And on that note, I'll say, this leads us to our fourth and final problem with Joseph Cambell's work is what's wrong, missing context. There are disciplines devoted to interpreting cultural stories. So I mentioned that Joseph Cambell has his roots in comparative literature. He's also drawing heavily from psychoanalysis. Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, right? So first off, psychoanalysis is pseudoscience. It's interesting. It's you know, it's not what a modern day or present day psychologist would consider to be science, right? The work of Carl Jung is really fascinating. It's not science. You know, the work of Sigmund Freud. Freud at one point was like, I don't even think that my theories can or should be tested because it's enough that I think they're true and that I see them in the people who come through my door, right? So like, you know, these guys are creating theory, and you could describe what they're doing as kind of like philosophy, but they're not sort of like trying to look systematically at the world and understand what they're seeing, like based on. They're not doing research in that way, right? And then even if you're looking at mythology through the lens of present day psychology, I would still say that's a missed opportunity because you are then really it limits the set of questions you're able to ask. You're looking at mythology as information about the mind, about information about the self and like the interior world. All of that is great. I'm not like disparaging any of these things. It's just that if you stop there, you're going to miss a lot, right? So psychology is not primarily a discipline that is dedicated to the study of myth. Although, fascinatingly, when myth comes up, it's almost always talked about in a psychological way. You know, looking for like what psychological insights can it yield. So meanwhile, we have these whole other disciplines that are dedicated to the study of these kinds of stories, and they have their own rules. They have their own like backgrounds. You know, this includes historians, this includes anthropologists, this includes folklorists, right? And they have just a completely different set of training and premises that they use to engage in these stories. And I'll give a couple examples. So this lady on the left, her name is Bender Shettler, and she is a historian. She is an Africanist. And she studies a time and place where there are no written records. You know, she is studying the Serengeti before colonial contact, where just like writing wasn't a thing, right? And so how do you do that? So she also, I will say, is doing a really uncommon feat in the world of history. When you read history, typically if you're reading a work of history by a professional historian, you're going to see a title like, you know, the such and such event from 1860 to 1920, or you're going to see this really tightly bounded period of years. You know, sometimes as little as 1 year, like a microhistory might be looking at changes that took place over 1 year. You know, 20, 50, 60, you know, is common. And the reason that historians tightly bound their inquiries is because as historians, part of the work of a historian is to go deep into an archive and to exhaustively read it. And you can't exhaustively read all of the archives in the world to do a history of 1,000 years, unless that's your life's work, and you spend your entire career building up to that. And that type of history is called the longue durée, the long duration, right? Like these hundreds of thousands of years narratives. And it's a rare thing for a historian to do responsibly, and this is one of the things this is what Shettler is doing. And the way that she's doing these, in her case, she's telling these like really extended, like 1,000-year stories. She's doing that through the study of mythology, through the study of oral tradition. So she talks to the people in those communities. She, you know, there's a lot of interdisciplinary stuff that she does with archaeology and all of these other things. But she listens to the people and their stories, and she analyzes them historically and tries to derive big picture, long scale events from those things. And she introduced two words to my lexicon, or two phrases that I often go back to as profound. One is core spatial images, and the other one is generative principles. So she listens to a myth, a cultural story, and she notices the core spatial images, that there is mountain, there is field, you know, and then she listens for the generative principles. Our people came to be when the person from the field came and met the person of the mountain. Like that right there could be like a cultural memory of a whole, like a migration event. Like that's something that there's a lot of validity in that kind of stuff. And so like listening for those deep patterns, again, like working with people from that culture to contextualize and reinterpret and collaboratively interpret that's really powerful, beautiful work. And that's something that's just like, you know, in its own universe compared to what we've been talking about to this point. The other guy, the guy here, which I won't say quite as much about, his name is Arnold van Gennep, if I'm saying that correctly. He lived from 1873 to 1957, and he is an anthropologist, and he he came up with a model to describe rites of passage, common rites of passage in societies. And this is the sort of hand sketch I found of the model that he developed. Does it look familiar? Here we have on the top a sense of stable identity that then goes down into a period of separation, and you enter sort of this liminal in-between state where, I don't know, there's a lot that's going on, a lot that's changing, and then you work your way back, you return, you come up back to stability. So well before Joseph Cambell made up the hero's journey, there were anthropologists who had noticed that this was a pattern that can be found in rites of passage. And it's not just about heroes, this is about any rite of passage. This happens during puberty, when you're coming of age. This happens when you're getting married or divorced. This happens when you're born. This happens when you die. This happens at these moments of life when your identity is changing. Things have been one way, and then they shift, and then they are a different way. And again, this isn't necessarily like a human universal. I'm not saying that every social or cultural pattern or a transition follows this pattern. But the point being, this is something that is a valid sort of like observation about the way that a lot of people in a lot of cultures experience change. And it predates the hero's journey, right? So like, you know, I would say that Joseph Cambell is sort of taking something that is real and true and maybe misimplying it or overextending it to suggest that, you know, all heroes are always following this particular pattern, or that, you know, I don't know, that it can be found in the ways that he thinks it can be. So, you know, so just again, tying a bow on this portion of this problem, why is missing context a problem? It's that, you know, A, if you're basing your theory on pseudoscience, that's not awesome. And B, again, it's a missed opportunity to learn from people who have sort of dedicated their careers to understanding these kinds of stories, and the things they've learned along the way, the things they've ruled out, the things they've picked up and refined. You're just not getting the benefit of all of that perspective, right? So, to bring us home, what I will say is there's a better way to do this. I want to share with you a quote about folklore. This is from the Harvard undergraduate program, a description of their program that they have over there, where they're talking about what are the skills that a folklore student is going to learn there in their program. And I love this. I love this list. It goes deep listening, observant participation, cross-cultural comparison, historic contextualization, collaborative interpretation, cultural documentation, empathetic engagement, and good storytelling. This goes to the heart of what a good ethnographer or a good folklorist is going to do. Again, like I want to highlight the collaborative interpretation piece of, you know, a folklorist is going to go and say, you know, like share your stories. I'd love to hear your stories, and they're going to say, instead of, oh yeah, that means this. I know that means this. They're going to say, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? Tell me about what that means. You know, they're going to talk to different people. They're going to notice how those stories are continually performed and renewed and transmitted to others. They're going to be listening deeply, not just. They're going to be trying to listen across beyond their own perspective. They're going to be trying to listen to not only the words that are spoken, but the silences that they hear as well. What's being said, what's not being said. They're going to, cross-cultural comparison is really fun and interesting, but they're going to contextualize that with history and culture and specificity. So, you know, to me, that's where it's at. That's the way that this kind of work should be taking place, right? I would suggest, you know, rather than engaging with myth stories as a way primarily to describe our own minds in an individualistic way, and you know, and using it as a sort of like inspiration for psychoanalysis, which again, like I truly am not against that, you know, like if that's something that's like personally meaningful, I think it's fine to do. But like, rather than letting it end there, rather than stopping with that, and certainly rather than basing our conclusions on sort of like irresponsible research, I would say like we can take these myths on their own terms. We can understand these stories in the context of time and place. We can listen to the communities that are its tradition bearers and try to understand what it means to them. And in other words, all this boils down to, we can use these texts as a way, not just to understand the clockwork of our minds, but to use it to understand the world we live in, the places, and also each other, communities that we might not be a part of. And that, I think, is a much better approach to mythology than what Joseph Cambell gave us. So that's my presentation. I welcome your questions or comments.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, kind of a lightning round, isn't it?
It's like an introduction to biblical exegesis.
Yeah,
I mean, you meet the same problem when you sit down and, well, what's the scripture for today?
yeah, that's right. And I mean, so next week, the topic of my session next week is looking at the difference between history and oral tradition as ways to tell stories about the past. And what you find when you set those side by side to compare them and what comes up. The third session is about like what do we do with all this? Like how does this, among other things, how does this inform one's reading of scripture? Because it does, it affects that. So. Yeah, Craig.
Question, thought, so they're going to be merged. Help me unpack it. So the people of Israel have a myth about their becoming a people.
Mm-hmm.
And great story, and then they had to reinterpret it when the Assyrians arrived,
Mm-hmm.
and when the Babylonians arrived, and when the Persians arrived, and when the Greeks arrived, and the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies, and finally the Romans. So
Yeah.
there's a core narrative in there, but it had to get, reinterpreted.
Yeah.
And the prophets usually had an explanation for why, fill in the blank, the conquering outsiders were victorious and why Israel was, destroyed, exiled, whatever. That would be true of any culture's myth, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's reinterpreted against, their own history.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why I'm so taken by that phrase, the core spatial images, because or like generative principles, because like if you look at the generative principles that show up throughout that lineage of like all the story changes, if you start to see like what is the gist that seems to be unchanged over time, that becomes a really interesting line of inquiry. And the other thing that I'll say is absolutely the stories change over time. They do have tremendous staying power. I think that as information technology, that oral tradition is like a very sophisticated information technology able to preserve information over thousands of years. We don't have any other information technology that has been able to do that, right? That's pretty incredible. I mean, like maybe tablets or books. But within that, it's also important to know that it's not like the static process that people transmit. The way these stories get sort of renewed and passed on, there is kind of a pruning process, similar to, speaking of psychology, similar to like the way that our own memories work with, neurologically, that like you have things you experience and then your memories of those things get pruned based on, like neurologically, like in your brain, based on what is still useful to you, what you need. The same thing is happening with story transmission, where we're saying like the way that I sum it up is what we have is what was needed, and there's a constant sort of every generation has to make that choice of taking what is received and figuring out what do I want to let go of and what do I want to hold on to and put forward. Yeah, go ahead.
We have in linguistics a parallel figure to Campbell. That would be Chomsky.
Okay.
And the same questions could be labeled against Chomsky that you could label here about Campbell. My question is really different. In this work that they did, it was so revolutionary at the time that it effectively cut the lines that tied us to an old wharf and allowed us to move into new areas. And so I think my question is, are these people important not because they got it together and gave us a model, but because they unhinged us from something that really wasn't working and opened a new path for us to consider? That's
really interesting. And like something that I think Joseph Cambell has done that I think is a gain is that he did make a really compelling argument that mythology is not just an irrelevant way back when silly delusion that we can all safely ignore, unless that's just our hobby. We like eagle-headed horses, like, he made the case that it can be, to a popular audience, that it can be important and relevant for everyday people to find out about. And that I think is good, like that's valid, so I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's my top of mind.
I guess I'm saying it's really easy to cast aspersions on what they missed,
Yeah,
but their importance isn't what they missed. Their importance is that cutting us off from what was going on before that never could have allowed us to move into true understanding.
yeah, I think that's a really valid, it's a valid thing to point out. I think that in Joseph Cambell's case, I'm a little hesitant to give him full points for it, because there were, like, this guy, the other anthropologist I mentioned, he predated him. Some of the folklorists that I consider to be, doing really, work that I want to emulate, work that I really admire. They were around the same period of time. They were doing that stuff. It's like I think that he was a little bit of a victim of his own blind spots, that he was operating from within psychoanalysis and comparative literature, and he just didn't know what he didn't know. He didn't know that there was this whole other fields where people were doing all of this really great, very different work with the same body of literature. And I think he was trying to pull, his interests were very interdisciplinary. I think he was trying to find something that was really true and nuanced and broad. I just think he didn't get there.
But I think PBS is what really spread the word of Joseph Cambell.
Yes.
Pledge drives. Joseph Campbell's pledge drives.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my gosh,
Oh, yeah.
incredibly popular.
It got
The best thing to watch on
everybody,
TV.
everyone was talking
Everyone in
about
the
it.
nation is watching and talking.
Remember that?
And there is, I was going to say, there's something in where Joseph Campbell sits here that is about awareness and popularity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it seems to me that anything that ends up being wildly popular is necessarily reductive.
Yeah.
Because, in order to appeal to the masses, you
Yeah.
really need to flatten and simplify, right? But what Joseph Campbell did in the popular imagination was give permission for a lot of casual storytelling and examination and sort of a revival of some of interest in this sort of thing. In terms of serious and academic work, that's a whole other issue. But I think that where his legacy exists is in that popularity and the popular imagination. And one of the things that I noticed that it did was it gave a framework for people to begin to consider how stories are told at all,
Mm-hmm.
and how they are constructed. And as I said, it's very productive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think this is absolutely fabulous. It's great to put him in context of a greater, of the greater history. And thank you very much. There is particularly for introducing us to the other, some of the other work being done in the other models.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. And I think, I think it's similar. There is a resonance between what you just said and kind of the a moment ago of creating, opening the door to people to be able to engage with the stuff and find meaning in it. That's valuable. And I think it's true that anytime you end up with something that's mass popularity, it does simplify and becomes reductive. I just, because I find myth and storytelling and oral tradition generally and folklore to be so valuable, I think that there's a way for everyday people to engage and find value in it that's less reductive, and I would hope that that's something that people can do, that people can find their way to. I wouldn't want it to stay in an academic vacuum for sure. I think that these stories are stories are important. Stories are important for everybody, right? And everybody should have access to them and be able to find meaning in them. But, yeah.
It makes it possible for people to approach and think, oh, I can think about stories, right?
Yeah.
People who don't have the educational background necessarily. And, but I also think that, that because it became so popular, that's also part of what made it so simple. Because people weren't examining it and questioning it and interrogating it and looking at the stereotypes and all. So, and this comes up for me as teaching writing for people that, because a lot of folks come into class having had this hero's journey model blasted at them, not just in everything that they had read and seen, right?
3-act
Yeah.
steps.
Yeah, and all the
Right.
structures on the journey and the call and the this and the that. And these are received as required elements, right?
Yep.
Or at least that this is a model for a successful story.
That's
Or-
that prescriptive piece. is
Yes,
like-
yes,
yeah.
exactly. And so it's an interesting thing to have them push back against that and break it apart. But you know, we're always looking for a simple formula, and it's wonderful to imagine that it would be easy.
Yeah, and simple formulas are great as long as they're not the only formula. I think that's the
Right.
trouble, is the
Yeah.
monopolization of,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, and then this is probably what we're gonna be discussing in a couple of weeks, but I just kept thinking like, scripture and the Jesus story.
Yep.
And how that has been and it continues to be flattened.
Yeah,
Right.
Yes.
And for an audience that doesn't want to think
Right.
too hard or explore.
And challenge.
and
Yeah.
and doesn't like incongruity.
Right, who wants a simple message.
Right, that's another thing of the incongruity, that's another thing about the hero's journey is, to make his case, he'll say, okay, the story happened a certain way, but then even within that tradition, like even if you're looking just at Greek myths, there are many other versions of that same myth that happened in a different way, where, that person didn't die, or that person didn't get swallowed, or whatever the case is. And that's another thing that's sort of confounding and also wonderful about folklore generally, is that there are all of these versions of the story, and you kind of have to almost let go of the idea of like, well, which one is the authoritative version? And it's like, all of these stories were told by the folk. They're all folklore, Yeah. All right.
All right, so
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for
Thank you.
Yeah, very much.